Hey, my name's James Nicholson and welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video, I want to talk to you about a group of politicians and tenants that are getting together with the goal of being able to fix up their properties and then charge the landlords. So I'm going to talk about why this potentially could be a major problem, and it's something that could happen all around the UK. So I think it's important to understand what is happening in certain areas of the UK and why those things potentially do move all around the UK and could impact you. Now, this is important, I think, to understand if you're a tenant or a landlord. I think it's important to really grasp what implications this could have on the market. Now, if you're new around here and you haven't done already, do make sure you subscribe to the channel over there and hit that bell notification. We're on the way to 44,000 subscribers, but what's in it for you? Well, we have the latest property news, house price news, interest rate news, investor news, and much, much more. By subscribing, you'll get all of that. And let's get some more views on this video by smashing like, tickling like, doing something to that like button. That really does help with the YouTube algorithm, and that's helped the channel grow. So thank you to everybody that does that. So what's going on? Well, up in Scotland, there's a group of 400 tenants in Glasgow that are basically joining together with local politicians up there and trying to get a bill put through the Scottish Parliament that would mean that tenants could essentially do maintenance to their property without the landlord's consent. At that stage, then the costs would be passed on to the landlord. Now, the bill talks about this is for absentee landlords. They're talking and saying that there are landlords in Scotland, particularly in Glasgow. They've got 400 tenants that are joining together on this. They're saying, look, they can't get hold of the landlords at all. They're trying to get work done, but the landlords either live abroad or they're just not interested and don't make any response. Now, already in those sorts of areas in the UK as a whole, there are rules on that kind of thing. So if a landlord doesn't do the property maintenance and doesn't fix stuff, you can take them to court. You can get the local council involved, and landlords can get fined severely for that kind of stuff. In fact, the Renters' Rights Bill that's going through in England and Wales would mean that landlords would be fined up to £10,000 for these kind of very issues. The problem here that I see is that sometimes these things could potentially get done in the wrong way. And if you give the tenant too many rights in order to pick who they want to fix a kitchen, then they're obviously not going to go for the cheapest price. That doesn't necessarily mean the best person, but they're also not incentivized to find any kind of good offer. And if a tradesman knows that and knows that they're getting paid regardless, then that could cost significantly more. Now, also, when you talk about these kind of issues, that tenants could force the landlord to do maintenance work and the tenant can get the work done and then invoice the landlords, that puts more fear in a landlord community that's already getting hit on the head with the Renters' Rights Bill, with tax rules, with EPC rules, and you'll make more quit. And ultimately for tenants, that's not good. You see, as the private rental sector shrinks, which we've seen in Scotland where they're talking about this happening, you could get as many as 200 people apply for one property. And yes, there are bad landlords. I want to be very clear on that. There are bad landlords that don't do the maintenance, but you already have mechanisms to get this sorted. Now, maybe tenants don't know that stuff, and that's in the council's way. The council should be letting tenants know, if you've got a problem with a landlord, contact us and we'll get it resolved for you. Or if they're running through an estate agent, that they go to the estate agent and you get it all documented. It can be a little bit difficult, but when the Renters' Rights Bill comes in, you'll have a much easier way in order to get landlords to take part. Now, if you are a landlord and you have maintenance issues with your property, you need to jump on them quickly, because all of these stories of landlords not doing things just don't help landlords as a whole. And that brings down the whole market, and it means that councils and local governments are going to come down even stricter and make things even harder for landlords going forward. So look, I have sympathy for tenants that don't get issues resolved. It's absolutely wrong, and landlords have a responsibility to get things sorted. However, I don't think an iron approach to things is always the best way. I think if you keep bringing out new legislation after new legislation, you'll just shrink the landlord and private rental market even more. In Scotland, they've already had things that have done that. So in COVID, they had a renters cap. And the rent cap meant that actually what happened was, instead of keeping rents where they were, a lot of landlords increased the rent prior. And when a tenant left the property, on remarketing it, they would put the rent up significantly. And the result of those rent caps was that a big chunk of landlords left the market, shrinking that private rental sector up in Scotland. But also the outcome was that rents went up 25% in only a few short years. And so governments have these policies that sound good on paper. And if you're watching this right now, you might be a tenant saying, what is this guy talking about? If I've got a problem with my boiler and my landlord's not coming back to me, then of course I want to be able to go and buy a boiler myself. And yeah, in some scenarios that could be an option, but there are already things that you can do. You can already contact your local council to resolve problems for you. You can contact estate agents and log stuff with those kind of people, because if you do that, that's the right way to do it. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't also pay your rent, but if you did have an absent landlord and you couldn't get hold of them, if you didn't pay your rent for 1 month, they'd be in touch pretty quickly. And that is a way that you could get someone's attention if so, but you should then start paying rent if you've got that communication going again. I think that's very, very important. So look, I don't see this as something particularly great, but what I do see is that all of these things that happen in Scotland, those ideas come down to Westminster and it gets the MPs thinking about what could we add on top of landlords to make the private rental sector a little bit more. And to me, it absolutely baffles me, because the private rental sector is shrinking. There's a housing crisis at the moment. The government, in fact, are reaching out to landlords to say, give us your property because we want to house the asylum seekers in there. And by doing that, they're shrinking the rental market even more. What I think is the best option is a collaborative approach. Help landlords, local councils helping landlords, government helping landlords would be much better and fix issues. I was on Talk TV the other day. We've got the government saying they're going to spend £30 billion building social housing. I bet they don't build hardly any properties with that. There's going to be so much red tape. What would be better in the areas that they're looking to do it, in Blackpool, in Sheffield, in Scunthorpe, in those areas there are thousands of empty properties. Why not get those properties up to scratch, make those social housing properties, and that would bring up the whole area, rather than having a street that has 20 properties with 2 empty properties. Why not have a street that has 20 full properties, and that re-energizes that area and makes everyone's property go up in value, and people feel that it's a much more worthwhile place to live. What do you think about this proposal by the Scottish government to basically invoice landlords after work is done? I think it's going to cost, if it happens, significantly more for landlords. And I think some people will just rush to get this done and say they couldn't get hold of someone, and then they'll get a boiler done by a council contractor that will charge 3 times the price than it could have done. And that would just mean that landlord quits the market and shrinks that rental sector even more. Love to know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Do like the video, do share the video, do check out all the other content as well on the channel, including this video right here.